hello fellow reader, I haven't noticed you before. Have you also wondered sometimes how interpreting a literary text differs from interpreting other kinds of texts? If yes, you've come to the right place, as we will discuss the field of literary hermeneutics today, a special field of understanding and interpreting literary texts in differentiation to other kinds of texts. And especially, or in particular, we will discuss this book, The Introduction to Literary Hermeneutics by the German scholar Peter Szondi. But first, I want to give you a short introduction to who I am and what you will find in this video. So, if you're new here, my name is Laura and I'm a PhD student of Comparative Literature in Germany. If you don't know what that is, I will link a video up here and also below in the description of the video, because I've been talking about this field of study in detail. If you know what it is, perfect, because that's important for this video as well. So on this channel I'm creating videos on literary classics, especially focusing on the origins of fantasy and science fiction literature, and also on Gothic literature and Gothic romance from the 18th and 19th century in particular. If you're interested in that, I will also link the playlists below, because I've been creating different kinds of playlists for the different kinds of videos that I'm making, if that makes sense. But I also have a third playlist on literary theory, in which I talk especially about the field of hermeneutics, which is the art and study of understanding and interpreting, especially of language in different kinds of forms, such as speech, but also texts. And I am only focusing on literary texts. This is what today's video is going to be about. And I'm also doing videos on aesthetics in the future, because that is like the other branch of study that I'm going to focus on. So if you're interested in that, please stay tuned for the future videos that are going to come up in autumn and winter. But today we want to talk about Peter Szondi and his literary hermeneutics, which is very close to the topic of my PhD thesis actually, which is why I love talking about it. So let me quickly introduce the structure of the video. First, I will tell you who Peter Szondi himself is and why he's famous, or why he was famous at the time when he was working in Berlin. Then I will talk a little bit about what is general hermeneutics and what is the difference to literary hermeneutics, and I will introduce you to the key ideas that Peter Szondi developed. And I will also give a short outlook to how these ideas were adopted and developed, or if they even were adopted and developed. And I will conclude with my own perspective on the hermeneutics of Peter Szondi and why I think that it's actually a very fascinating work that he's been creating there. So let's get started. So let's start with the life and times of Peter Szondi. I will blend in a picture of him here. Please excuse that I'm looking down on my notes every now and then, because I cannot keep all the dates and information in mind. So Peter Szondi was born in Budapest in the year 1929 to a Jewish family. And his early life was marked by turmoil, as his family was detained in 1944 in the concentration camp of Bergen-Belsen. And they were luckily ransomed under the so-called Kastner Agreement, which enabled them to escape the Nazis and eventually settle in Switzerland. After finishing school, Szondi was able to study languages and literature in Zurich and Paris, and was influenced in his thinking a lot by Theodor Adorno and Walter Benjamin. And he also became close friends with the Jewish poet Paul Celan. So after working in the field of literature for quite a while, Peter Szondi became the first director of the newly found Seminar for General and Comparative Literature at the Freie Universität Berlin in 1965. It was the first of its kind in Germany, and Peter Szondi is even considered as the founder of this institute, And it is still one of the most famous institutes in Germany. We also have an institute in Frankfurt and one in Munich, but the one in Berlin is by far the most famous one and also the biggest one. So if you're interested in studying comparative literature, you should definitely go there. But it was also important to Peter Szondi from the very beginning that it was not only comparative literature, but also general literature, because you need to have a general understanding of how language works and how interrelations even emerge, So it is not just this comparative, multi-language, multi-perspective aspect, but rather also like a general ground level understanding of literature. So these just go hand in hand actually. But in my video on comparative literature, I've only been focusing on that part. So these times when Peter Szondi was in this time when Peter Szondi was the director of the institute, it was definitely also a time of crisis and revolution, because the huge student revolutions happened in that time around 1968. So the late 60s were definitely marked by students rebelling against the structures, and for example they were especially asking for a reform of the typical lecture that a professor would give to students and just stand in front of them and not include them. And Szondi himself even realized that there were also different kinds of teaching methods necessary, and he would even agree to do other kinds of classes like seminars, like colloquiums, where people were more discussing and getting into dialogue more than he himself being like the professor standing in front of the students and just telling them all he knew about language and literature. So that was like the time when he was the director of this institute, and he was very famous, very influential. And his most famous work at first was the theory of modern drama. It was his PhD thesis, and it is quite widely known. But he's also been working on literary hermeneutics, and that's what I am focusing on because that's what I'm most fascinated by. So he's been giving a lecture on literary hermeneutics called Introduction to Literary Hermeneutics. And this lecture he was giving in the winter semester of 1967-68. Szondi has been very influential with his lectures and his classes he's been giving as a director of the Institute for General and Comparative Literature in Berlin. But he's only been director of this institute for 6 years, because in the year 1971 he committed suicide after his good friend Paul Celan has also committed suicide, and also his friend Theodor Adorno had been dying the year before in 1970 very suddenly, and he was very affected by that emotionally, and probably there's been also a lot of other reasons, but that also brought him to the decision to end his life and also end his life's work in that regard. So he initially had planned to make another lecture on literary hermeneutics and also more focusing on other aspects and also going further into the 20th century hermeneutics and also other kinds of branches of literary theory. And I think he would have probably been able to make a great impact on the whole field and great work. But as I said, he's not been able to finish this work at all. So that's just important to keep in mind if I'm talking about this, and also if you might wonder why he hasn't developed it any further than he did. So first, let me talk to you about what this Introduction to Literary Hermeneutics is about. So Szondi wonders why we have like a general hermeneutics that is focused on understanding in general, understanding speech and text especially. So before delving into what this literary hermeneutics lecture is even about, I quickly want to talk about why Szondi even bothered creating that lecture and what were his main concerns. So he's been writing this short text about the state of research on literary hermeneutics. In this text, Szondi uses a quite compelling and strong picture of describing how at a hermeneutic symposium a literary scholar would sit next to a jurist and a theologian as the poor relative, because he has quite important ancestors and his place is also very important and has also been his place for a long time. But he still cannot add so much to it, because he says that the new philologies that are not like the classical philologies, but like German, Roman studies and everything that has been emerging on starting in the 19th century onwards to the 20th, none of them have actually been able to build a specific literary hermeneutics that is really focused on understanding literary texts. And he's really wondering why that is the case. He just describes that many of the schools that have been emerging, such as the neocriticism or positivism or other schools, they have been focusing on so many details or special perspectives on literary texts that they just lost focus of the more general questions of what does it even mean to understand a literary text, you know? So that's like the starting point of Peter Szondi's question. So that's the initial interest that he has when creating this lecture series on literary hermeneutics. So this lecture has later been published in 1975 under the same name, Introduction to Literary Hermeneutics, in this edition. And it is quite a compelling overview of hermeneutics. Szondi actually starts in ancient times, telling how hermeneutics started when people didn't understand the writings of Homer anymore, so such as the Odyssey and the Iliad, and they had to find new ways of interpreting and making sense of the text. So hermeneutics was founded in a way, and then it has developed over time, especially in the field of theology, but also in law studies, and it's been changing and developing all the time, also in the philological field and later on even in philosophy. I've been talking about hermeneutics, as I said before. Hermeneutics in general is the study and art of understanding and interpretation. If you're interested in the videos, I've been doing a video on hermeneutics by Friedrich Schleiermacher, who is considered one of the most famous advocates for hermeneutics and also like the scholar who's been advocating for it. He's been writing and working in the 19th century. There's a video here, and there's also a video on understanding and misunderstanding and its relationship, and a video on the concept of the hermeneutic circle. I will also link it up here and below in the description. So if you want a little bit more overview on these fields, I will definitely recommend watching these videos, because I've been talking in more detail about it, and maybe you can better understand where I'm coming from when talking about this literary hermeneutics, and also where Szondi himself is coming from. So what he does in this lecture here in this book is that he goes through history of hermeneutics, and he's always asking the question, how could a literary hermeneutics look like, in also in difference to a general hermeneutics or the hermeneutics that has been developed before. And he's looking in a lot of detail on the writings of some scholars. So in the beginning, after giving this overview, he's focusing on the work of Johann Martin Gladenius and Georg Friedrich Meyer, who have been interested in understanding history and understanding philosophy, and also using hermeneutics as a philosophical concept and a means to understand texts and also to decipher them, to really structure them, to understand arguments, and to really also make sure that if you're writing a text yourself or if you're giving a speech, you have a logical structure. So that's like more on the logical and philosophical side of hermeneutics. And he's been looking at that, and he's trying to find elements that could also be relevant for literary hermeneutics. And there's quite a few elements. I will not go into detail about all of them, but that's like the basis. And then he's also talking about Friedrich Wolf and Friedrich Ast, who are both classical philologists and also historians. So they are mostly focused on understanding antiquity, which is also interesting and also relevant for literary hermeneutics in a way, but also it's not quite the focus. And then he goes over to Friedrich Schleiermacher, who has been the first one to really try to systematically create this kind of general hermeneutics that is really applicable to both speech and text. So this is actually what Szondi says is like the most relevant starting point for a literary hermeneutics, because you can really build on this foundation of a general hermeneutics, because Schleiermacher has really been working on the foundation and the basic principles that you need to understand literary texts as well as other texts. So literary texts are just like a special kind of text that make use of language in a special way and that are having like a special kind of structure that you can understand better if you have like the right methodological tools, but also if you have like this very basic understanding that lays in the foundation of the general hermeneutics. And that's basically what Szondi says here. And then he also covers the later hermeneutics. He also looks at Wilhelm Dilthey, who's been like a pupil of Schleiermacher. He's been very much influenced of him, and he's been publishing his work on hermeneutics in 1900, I think. So he's basically been writing a very long essay on why Schleiermacher's hermeneutics is great. I will also talk about that in the future in another video, so please stay tuned for that, because Dilthey is also very influential, I think. But then you also have like short sections in which Szondi also refers to Heidegger and Gadamer. Martin Heidegger, you probably know, it's quite a famous philosopher, and he's also connected to the philosophical school of existentialism, of understanding yourself, and the so-called concept of Dasein, so being in this world, in this time. It's quite difficult, so I'm not really quite sure whether I will be able to explain Heidegger myself. And his pupil then is Hans-Georg Gadamer, who also shaped hermeneutics greatly. So he's also been influenced by Heidegger a lot, but he's also been influenced by the others. So he's like trying to find a connection between them in a way, whilst Heidegger is really focused on understanding as a means of understanding yourself in this world. So really focused on this existential being thing, while Gadamer tries to find a bigger framework for understanding not only yourself, but also how language works and how we understand each other in dialogue, how we make use of language, and how this is all connected. So his work called Truth and Method is focusing on different aspects of understanding, and it's also quite compelling. So I will definitely talk about Gadamer in the future as well. But let me get back to Szondi first. So what Szondi says about Heidegger and Gadamer's work is that although they are very influential and important for the history of hermeneutics, they don't really have a lot to say for a literary hermeneutics, because, as I've said, Heidegger is focused on the so-called concept of Dasein and the existentialism. So that's not really related to understanding texts. And Gadamer is also interested in understanding text and speech and language, but he really denies giving any kind of a methodological approach. So although his book is called Truth and Method, he really refrains from giving any kind of methodological approach or ideas, and he even says so in the beginning of his work. So that's why Szondi says it's not really so useful for developing a literary hermeneutics as a method for interpreting literary texts, because Gadamer just doesn't really say much about that. That is not to say that it's not important, as I said, but it is not so important for a literary hermeneutics. So what are the key points that Szondi makes? He is making especially 2 points, and then there's a third that has often been overlooked, I think, and that I am going to focus on in my PhD thesis. Szondi focuses especially on the hermeneutics of Schleiermacher, as I said, as a basis for understanding literary text in particular. And he says the most important aspect of literary text is actually that they are made of language, and you really have to understand the language and to develop a really well understanding of everything that is at work in a text. So being it like the literary devices and the ways that it is made use of dialogue, of narrative techniques, of images, of meter, of rhyme, of tone as well. And you have to take in all these aspects, because in literary texts they are used much more than in other kinds of texts, and they are also really put to use in a very special kind of way. So they serve purposes and they have functions to transport kinds of messages or to offer perspectives on texts, and that is what is really strong. So there's been this grammatical and psychological side of interpretation in Schleiermacher's work. So the grammatical side focuses on the language especially, and the psychological side focuses more on the author and understanding the biography of the author, and also like in front of this like broader context of understanding the author's life and times through the novel, and also understanding the novel in this life and times of the author. So that is also quite important, but it's actually been emphasized a lot after the works of Friedrich Schleiermacher has been published. So for example, Wilhelm Dilthey has been emphasizing this psychological aspect a lot more, and others have been drawing on that as well. So this grammatical side of things and the language part has been just getting out of focus in a way. And that's what Szondi stresses. So you really have to focus on the language and to really understand the language and everything that's connected with it. So that's the only way you will make sure you really understand a literary text and its literary devices. And the second point focuses on understanding yourself as an interpreter in relation to history, through the historical context, and also the historical standpoint that you yourself occupy and also that the work occupies. So it is really important to take into account that you reading a novel, for example, in the year 2024, 2025, whenever you're watching this video, you are reading a novel from 1825, let's say. So you're not reading it at all in the same manner that a person would have read it at that time in the year 1825 when it was first published, and society was different, political, economical, sociological issues were different at that time. And that really does play a big role. Also reading in general, like also the material reading, is different, and that's also just things you really have to take into account. So Szondi says you cannot just expect to make yourself familiar with like the life and times of the author, although that is really important. You cannot expect to have the same kind of understanding or even develop that than a person at that time, like the initial readership would have had. And when you read the work of Schleiermacher, he says that the main goal should actually be to just set yourself in that environment and to like put yourself on the same stage with this initial readership to understand who this text was speaking to, who it was addressing, what kind of people that could have been, and what like the text could have eventually meant to the people. But Szondi really says that this is just really not possible. So you always have yourself and you're standing in this context of your own life and times, and you really have to take that into consideration and just critically reflect that, of course, but also see that you cannot really get rid of that. So he, like Szondi, criticizes classical philology, for example, for that. It always tries to make a text like more accessible for everyday life and to try to eradicate all of the differences and the layers that are in between, so we can like attempt to understand it the same way that people would have understood it in ancient times. But he says that it's really not possible. So we just have to see that we are another kind of readership now than the readership has been from a text that's been published like a few years ago or a few hundred or 1,000 years ago. And I think that's really important because before, if you're looking at the history of hermeneutics, I think the main goal of many of the hermeneutists was actually to try to close the gap between the historical or original readership and the current or at that time contemporary readership, and to just really try to make an effort to understand everything. But it's just not possible. It's just more important to reflect on that and to see, I am reading this text and I've got this kind of idea before reading it. I've got these prejudices, I've got these influences, and I also have this kind of understanding, for example, even just of special kinds of usage of words or concepts, images, things like that. So you really just have to reflect that, and you cannot just try to erase your own standing point in history. So just take that into account and try to see that it's not a problem, but it's just something you have to work with, and you also have to openly state that. So seeing that you are reading this text at this time, what does that imply? What kind of consequences does that have for your understanding, and how is that definitely different from another person reading that text, and like also having this subjective layer to it. So that is definitely also another important aspect. And the third and final aspect that I want to talk about is one that I think or feel has been overlooked a little bit from the scholars working on Szondi later on. It's the idea that in like comparison to classical philology or also philological hermeneutics in general, trying to understand texts, a literary hermeneutics should have another kind of premise when interpreting, and the premise is that literary texts have a so-called aesthetic character. So that's the kind of premise that you should set before even starting to interpret a literary text. Literary texts have this aesthetic character, they have aesthetic features, they are artworks, and you should interpret and treat them as such. And I think that is quite an influential and even a little bit revolutionary idea, because although literary works have been treated as artworks probably for a longer time, it is important to just really see what that means and to work on that aspect. And I think the problem might be that Szondi just mentions that at the beginning of his lecture, but he doesn't really work on that in the longer run. The point that nobody really took that idea and made it into a broader framework or even developed a kind of literary hermeneutics yet is that Szondi didn't really stress that point so much. He just mentions it at the beginning, and then he also mentions literary works as artworks every now and then, but he's more focused on this as I said, the language in general and understanding also the authorial intentions and understanding yourself in this historical framework. These are like the most important parts of his introduction to literary hermeneutics, but this aesthetic character and the aesthetic features of texts like literary texts as artworks, that is nothing that really comes into full bloom in his lecture in a way. So I think that might be why it has been a little bit overlooked, and also a reason why Szondi's work has not been adopted by other scholars so much might be that hermeneutics in general has been spiraling downwards after the 1970s, I think, because you had influences like the postmodern deconstructivism, you had structuralism, you had later on post-colonialism, you had so many different kinds of fields and ideas, and especially the postmodern ideas of deconstructivism, which said there's no, like, not a fixed meaning for a text, or a text is even just like a web of quotes, as Roland Barthes, for example, said. That is just like anti-hermeneutical in a way, and I will talk about that in a future video as well, but there was like no foundation for these hermeneutic ideas anymore. So widely in literary studies, hermeneutics has not been popular for quite some time. I think it's getting more popular over the last decade or so. But before, people have been exploring so many other approaches to literary texts and literary theory and developing other kinds of theoretical strands. So that's why the hermeneutics hasn't been developed, and also the literary hermeneutics. And that's why I want to pick especially that part, that idea of the aesthetic character and understanding literary works as artworks, and what does that imply by combining hermeneutics and aesthetics. I will talk about that in another video as well. So if you're interested, please stay tuned. If you have any questions, just also drop them below, please. And if you've stayed till the end, thank you very, very much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, though this video might not have been the deepest deep dive into the work and times of Peter Szondi, but I think I could just give you an impression of what literary hermeneutics can be in comparison to general hermeneutics, and also what this lecture has been about. So if I mention Szondi in a future video, you might be a little bit more clear on what I'm talking about. As I said, if you have any kind of questions or requests, please just drop them below in the comments. I would be happy to answer them, and also to discuss other questions or other topics in future videos. Thank you very much for watching. I will link the other videos on hermeneutics, literary theory, and everything else below in the description. You can always just click through my playlist. There's everything's linked, and I will see you in my next video. If you like the video, please consider subscribing to the channel, because it helps the channel grow and other people also find it. Also like the video if you want, and yeah, I hope I will see you in the next video. Thank you, and bye bye.